They built the largest empire in history, and then it vanished like dust in the wind. Here's what really brought the Mongols to power, and what destroyed them from within. You've heard of Genghis Khan. You might have even seen his face on vodka bottles or conspiracy memes. But behind the legend is a real story of brutal battles, broken promises, unimaginable conquest, and a collapse that no one saw coming. Today we're diving deep into how a group of scattered tribes from the cold Mongolian steppes rose to dominate the known world and then fell just as fast. This isn't just another history lesson. It's a masterclass in how empires rise and fall, how loyalty can conquer armies, and how success itself can become the greatest enemy. Stick around, because the final twist in this story might actually change how you see power forever. The steppes of Mongolia in the 12th century were a nightmare landscape. Endless grasslands stretched beyond the horizon, punctuated only by the occasional mountain range or frozen river. Winters here could kill a man in minutes. Summers brought drought that turned the grass to dust, and scattered across this hostile terrain were dozens of tribes, each one fighting for survival, each one convinced that their neighbours were the enemy. This was a world where weakness meant death, where children learned to ride before they could walk, and where the strong took everything while the weak got nothing. Into this world was born a boy named Temüjin. His birth was supposedly marked by a blood clot in his tiny fist, which the shaman said meant he would be a great leader. But prophecies don't feed starving children. When Temüjin was just 9 years old, his father Yasuge was poisoned by the Tatars, sworn enemies of his clan. The poison worked slowly, agonizingly. Yasuge knew he was dying, but he managed to drag himself home to warn his family before collapsing in their yurt. With the clan leader dead, everything fell apart. The tribe abandoned Temüjin's family, taking their horses, their livestock, their protection. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a handful of loyal followers. Temüjin's mother, Huelun, was left to raise 5 children alone in one of the harshest environments on earth. They lived like animals, hiding in the forests, eating roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. Sometimes they ate mice, sometimes they ate nothing. But Temüjin wasn't just fighting hunger. He was fighting his own half-brothers for scraps of food. The competition was so fierce that when his half-brother Bekta kept stealing fish that Temüjin had caught, the young boy made a decision that was to define the rest of his life. He and his full brother Khazar stalked Bekta across the steppes and shot him down with arrows. Temüjin was maybe 13 years old when he committed his first murder. His mother was horrified, but Temüjin showed no remorse. Survival was survival. And he didn't just survive. He built an empire that spanned over 9 million square miles. That's more than the size of Africa. The young man who emerged from this crucible of suffering was unlike anything the steppes had ever seen. Temüjin wasn't the strongest warrior or the richest chief, but he understood something that his rivals didn't. In a world where everyone fought everyone, the person who could unite people would rule them all. He started small, gathering outcasts and misfits, men who had been cast out from other tribes, men who had nothing left to lose. He promised them something revolutionary, that loyalty would be rewarded regardless of bloodline. This was radical thinking. In Mongol society, everything depended on which family you were born into. Your tribe, your status, your future were all determined by blood. But Temüjin created a new system based on merit and loyalty. If you could fight, if you were smart, if you were faithful to him, then you could rise through the ranks. Former slaves became generals. Enemy warriors who showed courage were welcomed into his inner circle. He took the traditional Mongol military system and turned it upside down. Instead of organizing his army by tribe, which meant warriors would always be more loyal to their clan than to him, Temüjin created units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000 men drawn from different tribes. He mixed them together deliberately, so their primary loyalty would be to him and to each other, not to some distant chief. This wasn't just military strategy, it was social engineering on a massive scale. By 1206, he was no longer Temüjin. He was Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The Mongol military machine that Temüjin created was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Every Mongol warrior was essentially a mounted archer, capable of firing arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. But these weren't just individual fighters. They operated as coordinated units with discipline that would make modern armies jealous. When they charged, it wasn't a chaotic mob. It was a precisely timed wave of death. Their speed was legendary, and for good reason. A Mongol warrior didn't ride just one horse. He rode with a string of 4 or 5 horses, switching between them to keep the animals fresh. This meant they could cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. While European knights were struggling to move 30 miles in a day with their heavy armour and single horses, Mongol warriors were covering 100 miles or more. They could appear out of nowhere, strike like lightning, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. But speed meant nothing without intelligence, and the Mongols were master spies. Before they attacked any target, they would spend months or even years gathering information. They would send merchants, diplomats and traders to study the defences, map the layouts, identify the key leaders. They knew exactly where to strike before they ever drew their bows. They understood their enemies better than their enemies understood themselves. Their psychological warfare was just as devastating as their physical attacks. The Mongols had a simple policy: surrender immediately and you might be spared. Resist and everyone dies. They would make examples of cities that fought back, slaughtering every living thing and leaving the ruins as a warning to others. Word of these massacres spread faster than their armies, and often cities would surrender without a fight, rather than face the Mongol fury. And they weren't just brawn, they were brains. This is where the Mongol Empire separated itself from every other conquering force in history. Instead of destroying everything they conquered, they absorbed it. They used Chinese engineers to build siege weapons that could crack the walls of any fortress. They employed Persian scholars to manage taxes and administration across their vast territories. Muslim doctors ran their hospitals and treated their wounded. Jewish merchants handled their trade networks. Christian missionaries served as their diplomats. Genghis Khan's army wasn't just Mongol, it was a multicultural war machine that grew stronger with every conquest. When they captured a city, they didn't just loot it and burn it down. They identified the most skilled craftsmen, the best engineers, the smartest administrators, and they put them to work for the empire. A Chinese siege engineer captured in Beijing might find himself building catapults for an attack on Baghdad. A Persian mathematician taken in Samarkand might end up calculating taxes in Kiev. This policy of absorption created a snowball effect. The more territory they conquered, the more resources they had. The more resources they had, the more territory they could conquer. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, he had conquered more territory than Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar combined. But here's the thing, Genghis was just the beginning. After Genghis died, his empire didn't crumble. It exploded. His descendants carried the torch and pushed the boundaries even further. His son Ugedei Khan conquered Russia and swept into Eastern Europe, crushing Polish and Hungarian armies that had never faced anything like Mongol tactics. His grandson Kublai Khan didn't just conquer China, he became China, founding the Yuan dynasty and ruling from the Forbidden City, like a Chinese emperor. His other grandson Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Islamic Golden Age and destroying libraries that contained centuries of human knowledge. But the conquest that really shows the scope of Mongol ambition was their invasion of Java. Think about that for a moment. These were people from the frozen steppes of Mongolia, and they launched a naval invasion of tropical islands thousands of miles from their homeland. They built fleets, learned naval warfare, and projected their power across oceans. This wasn't just territorial expansion, this was global domination, on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the European colonial empires centuries later. The Mongols ruled over 100 million people across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. At its peak, their empire covered roughly 16% of the entire Earth's land surface. To put that in perspective, the British Empire at its height controlled about 23%, but it took them 3 centuries to build that empire. The Mongols did it in less than a century. This was the peak. Roads were safe for the first time in centuries. A merchant could travel from Korea to Venice with a single Mongol passport, protected by the same laws, using the same currency, speaking to officials who recognized the same authority. Trade boomed like never before. The Silk Road became a superhighway for culture, technology, and ideas. Gunpowder, printing, paper money, the compass, all of these innovations spread along Mongol trade routes. This was Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, was a marvel of organisation. They built relay stations every 25 miles across their empire, with fresh horses and supplies always ready. A message could travel from Beijing to Eastern Europe in just a few weeks, faster than any communication system before the telegraph. Marco Polo used this system to travel from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan, and when he returned to Italy, people thought he was making it all up. The wealth and sophistication he described seemed impossible to European minds, but the higher you climb, the harder you fall, and the Mongol Empire was already showing cracks. The very success that made them unstoppable was creating new problems. Their empire was becoming too big, too diverse, too complex for the traditional Mongol way of governing. So what went wrong? How does the largest empire in history fall apart in just over a century? The answer lies in understanding that the Mongols were victims of their own success. The very qualities that made them great conquerors made them terrible at governing a settled empire. Well, it wasn't one thing. It was a cocktail of chaos that built up over decades. The first problem was that they got too big, too fast. The Mongols stretched themselves thin across continents. Imagine trying to run a modern business across 30 time zones without phones, without internet, without even reliable roads in many places. Communication was fast by medieval standards, but not fast enough to manage an empire that spanned from Korea to Poland. Each corner of the empire had different languages, religions, customs, and priorities. What worked in the Chinese provinces didn't work in the Middle Eastern territories. What made sense in Russia was completely wrong for Central Asia. And while Genghis was a genius at uniting people around a common cause, his grandsons and great-grandsons were raised in luxury. They never experienced the harsh life of the steppes that forged their ancestors' character. They were born in palaces, not yurts. They learned about war from tutors, not from survival. The hunger that drove Genghis to greatness was something they had only heard about in stories. The second problem was the succession curse. Mongol rulers didn't follow clean inheritance laws. They followed blood, and blood often led to bloodshed. When a great Khan died, the heirs would fight over who got what. This led to civil wars, split kingdoms, and power-hungry cousins backstabbing each other like it was a medieval episode of Succession. Eventually, the empire split into 4 Khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. At first they played nice, but when they started ignoring orders from the main capital, the unity was gone. The third problem was that the locals fought back. At first people feared the Mongols, but after a while they got used to them. They started learning Mongol tactics, building their own armies, and resisting occupation. In China, rebellions broke out. In the Middle East, resentment grew. In Russia, princes learned how to mimic Mongol rule and eventually took over. And the Mongols, they got comfortable, lazy, even corrupt. Let's zoom into two parts of the empire to understand how it's all unravelled. First, the Yuan dynasty in China. Kublai Khan was the most powerful man in the world. He wore silk robes, lived in marble palaces, and entertained guests in cities that made Paris look like a village. But he also drifted far from his Mongol roots. He trusted Chinese advisors more than Mongol ones. He relied on paper money. He even tried to invade Japan twice. Both times, massive storms destroyed his fleet. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind, and as Kublai aged, the empire's problems grew. Economic troubles, natural disasters, peasant revolts. After Kublai's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty limped along until Chinese rebels finally overthrew it in 1368 and founded the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were pushed back to the steppe, and they never returned to power in China. In Russia, the Golden Horde ruled through fear and taxation. They didn't change local laws, they just made princes pay tribute, lots of it. But over time, those same Russian princes started acting like Mongols themselves. They built up cavalry armies, they taxed their own people, they unified under a strongman, Ivan III. By the late 1400s, Russia refused to pay tribute, and the Mongols were too weak to stop them. Russia would go on to become an empire of its own. But its early DNA was 100% Mongol influenced. There was no single fall of the Mongol Empire. It was death by 1,000 cuts. But if you had to pick one moment that symbolised the end, it would be this. In 1368, the Ming dynasty took over Beijing. The great Mongol capital, Khanbalik, fell to Chinese rebels. The empire Genghis dreamed of was now ruled by the very people he once conquered. And across the rest of Asia, the Ilkhanate collapsed due to civil war and famine. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into warlord states. The Golden Horde broke apart after Timur, also known as Tamerlane, crushed them. By the end of the 15th century, the Mongols were no longer rulers. They were memories. The Mongols didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they became everything they once conquered, rich, soft and divided, obsessed with power instead of unity, trapped in palaces instead of out riding in the cold wind. They forgot the lessons of the steppe, but their legacy is still here. Russia's central power structure, China's Yuan architecture, Persian art and science, the Silk Road's influence on trade. Even words like horde and Khan still echo in languages today. And remember this, the Mongols didn't just conquer land, they reshaped the map and the mind. From warrior nomads to empire builders to fading legends, their story is a lesson in how fast power can rise and how even faster it can fall. The empire that once stretched from Korea to Hungary, that connected East and West like never before, crumbled not from external enemies but from internal decay. The very success that made them unstoppable also planted the seeds of their destruction. They conquered the world but lost themselves in the process.